Scars in the Dust. The thunder of hooves shattered the stillness of the Texas night, echoing off the hills of Hillstone like a forgotten war drum. Moonlight spilled in broken streaks across the dry brush and dust-choked ground, casting the silhouette of a lone rider fighting to control a wild, half-mad Mustang. The horse reared, panic in every muscle, and the rider held tight, whispering something not meant for the wind. Then, suddenly, the Mustang faltered. Its legs buckled. A deep red bloom spread across the dirt like spilled wine. Morning came slow and heavy, as if even the sun hesitated to rise. At the edge of a weathered property nestled in the scorched hills of Hillstone, Texas, a bitter wind kicked up dry dust from the cracked road. The old Whitaker Ranch, once proud, now sagged under years of neglect. Heat clung to the land like regret, thick and unmoving. Grace Whitaker stood silent beside the fence, the weight of the sunrise etched into her face. She wore denim and an old flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled high, exposing the pale, ridged scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow like a road map no one wanted to read. That scar had a name: shrapnel, Afghanistan. A clinic in the desert, blown apart by an IED. Grace had been a combat medic then, carving stitches and stealing time from death with hands steadier than her voice. But that was another life. These days, she mended broken fence posts and fed horses who didn't ask questions. Behind her, the barn groaned in protest as the heat swelled the timber. The rooster, half-hearted in its duty, let out a crow that cracked midway through. Storm, the gray Mustang she'd rescued 5 years back, stood still as stone near the corral. He wasn't flashy, wasn't built for ribbons or cameras, but the land seemed to recognize him, and he returned the favor with a kind of quiet dignity. She found him after a summer storm that ripped the valley clean. Half dead, ribs like piano keys beneath his hide, a wound festering on his leg that smelled like rot and death. Grace hadn't planned to bring him home. Hadn't planned anything since the war, really, but there'd been something in his eyes. Something that looked like hers, no halter, no whip. She earned his trust in inches, not strides, and day by day, the two of them stitched themselves back together. Her from memories she didn't talk about. Him from wounds that spoke louder than words ever could. The sudden arrival of a truck shattered the fragile peace. A black F-350 rolled in like a bad omen, all chrome, shine, and arrogance. Grace didn't need to see the logo to know who it was. Redford Ranch. Hillstone's royalty. Chuck Redford stepped out with boots too clean and a hat that had never seen honest sweat. Behind him came Travis, his son, slick smile, mirrored shades, and the smirk of someone who thought the world owed him applause. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of the Whitaker Ranch," Chuck said, offering a grin as smooth as cheap whiskey. Didn't know this place still had a pulse. Grace said nothing. She shifted slightly, spine straightening like a flagpole. Chuck held out a pamphlet. Thick stock, glossy ink, all shine and ego. National Horsemanship Showcase, San Antonio. Thought you might want to represent the local flavor. Bring your creature. Travis snorted. Might win, most likely to limp off stage. Grace took the pamphlet with the same expression she might give a dying snake. Calm, cool, and already thinking of where to bury it. Storm stirred beside her. His ears twitched, and he stepped once, slow and deliberate. Grace moved slightly between him and the men, not in defense, but in silent declaration. Chuck laughed. Suit yourself, we'll be there. Some folks come for ribbons, some come to make a point. As the truck disappeared in a blur of dust and exhaust, Grace didn't move for a long time. That night, Lily found her in the tack shed, oiling a saddle that hadn't felt a horse's back in 3 decades. It had been her father's. Stamped on the leather, the edges worn smooth by years of rides that never got written down. "You're going, aren't you?" Lily's voice was quiet but not unsure. Grace kept her eyes on the saddle. "We don't have anything to prove." "Not to them," Lily said. "To yourself. And to Storm. They laughed, Grandma. Like you were nothing. Like he was nothing." Grace looked up then. The room smelled of leather and memory. "We'll go," she said, "but we won't go to win." "Then why?" Lily asked. "To remind them," Grace answered, placing the saddle down with care. "Some things don't need permission to matter." Outside, Storm stood in the dark, his eyes catching the porch light, unblinking. Watching, waiting. He had already known. He always did. Under the arena lights. The road into San Antonio was long, unkind and unceremonious, stretching past vast cattle pastures and sun-scorched hills until it dissolved into the bustle of highways and flashing billboards. The Whitaker truck coughed and growled its way through the final stretch like a relic dragging the weight of memory behind it. Its trailer, patched with scavenged metal and hope, groaned with each turn. Grace gripped the wheel tightly, jaw clenched, not because of the road ahead, but because she knew exactly what waited at the end of it. Beside her, Lily sat folded into the seat, a binder of competition forms, maps, and penciled notes on her lap. Her fingers moved with nervous energy, flipping pages, smoothing corners, as if she could organize the world into making sense. Outside, the landscape shifted from open country to polished concrete as they entered the gates of the San Antonio National Horsemanship Showcase, a place that felt less like a venue and more like a monument to money. Stables glinted in the sun, freshly painted, some with digital signage above their doors. Trailer rigs lined the lots like tour buses, bearing ranch logos in embossed gold or silver. Assistants in embroidered polos moved with walkie-talkies and purpose. It was the kind of place where names mattered, and old reputations could still buy new respect. The moment Grace stepped out of the truck, eyes turned. Not many competitors arrived in a rust-bitten GMC, much less one hauling a trailer held together by bolted sheets and a prayer. A young man in a fitted staff uniform approached with clipboard in hand, his face a careful mixture of politeness and restrained skepticism. He looked over Grace's entry paperwork, his gaze pausing a beat too long on the Whitaker Ranch name. "You'll be in stall 47, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the far end of the complex, back corner of the east barn. It wasn't hard to figure out what that meant. The farthest point, out of sight, where the grounds began to rot and the prestige thinned out. Grace didn't argue. She took the paperwork and nodded once. Lily, trailing behind her, glanced at the pristine stalls they passed, each one larger than their entire tack shed back home, and said nothing, though the stiffness in her spine said enough. Stall 47 was damp. The concrete was cracked in places and the wooden panels had absorbed years of mildew. A faint stench of ammonia lingered where someone had tried, and failed, to cover it with disinfectant. Grace opened the trailer and coaxed Storm down the ramp slowly. The Mustang stepped out with the kind of unhurried grace that made no apology for the scars across his flank. His coat had been brushed until it caught the sun in streaks of silver and ash, but there was no hiding that he didn't belong in a row of warm-blood champions. Across the barn corridor, Travis Redford stood polishing the bridle of his father's prize stallion. A tall, gleaming bay with legs like steel rods and a braided mane that hung like silk. He looked up, then smirked. "I see the museum brought in new exhibits," he said to no one in particular, loud enough to be heard. Grace kept walking. Lily gave him a glance as sharp as a spur, but didn't stop either. Inside the stall, Grace checked the feed bucket, cleaned what she could, and laid out fresh bedding. Storm sniffed the space, then stood still, watching her like he always did. Quiet, patient, alert. He didn't need assurance, just presence. That night, while the other barns buzzed with last-minute drills and trainers barking commands, Grace led Storm to a quiet practice pen tucked behind the unused western pavilion. The moon was low, a fat coin in the dark. There were no lights, only the soft crunch of dirt beneath hooves and the occasional night wind. Here, Grace removed the reins and halter. She stepped back, hands at her sides, and waited. Storm blinked, unmoving. Then, slowly, she shifted her weight to the left, took a single breath, and the Mustang responded. One step, then two, a pivot, a gentle shoulder yield, no words, no reins, just breath and gravity. Lily sat nearby in silence, arms wrapped around her knees, watching like she was afraid to even blink. They had practiced this, in private, never for show. Grace never thought she'd use it. But that night she knew this wasn't just about proving Storm's worth. It was about reminding herself that instinct, patience, and trust still had a place in a world obsessed with control. By morning, word had spread. Some had seen the Whitaker entry, fewer had cared. Most assumed it was just an old woman and her scrub Mustang until their number was called. The arena roared with sound, then went still as Grace stepped into the light. The judges, seated behind polished tables, barely glanced up. The announcer called her name, flat, obligatory. And then Storm moved. No bridle, no saddle, no rope. He moved like he'd been born for this moment, every step a quiet rebellion against expectation. He spun, lifted, pirouetted, the muscles along his back rippling like silk beneath light. The levade, delicate, precise, nearly impossible without months of formal schooling, he held for 4 full seconds. Hooves curled beneath him like he was preparing to launch into flight. The silence in the crowd wasn't just a surprise, it was reverence. Phones dropped. Conversations stopped. Even Travis Redford, lounging near the arena gate, stood up. When it was over, Grace bowed her head once. Storm stood beside her, breathing steady, calm as still water. Then a man from the judges' table stood. Tall, silver-haired, with a sharp crease to his jacket and a reputation that echoed through the barns. Thomas Granger. Head judge. Authority carved into bone. He stepped forward, looking not at Grace, but at the horse. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have papers for this Mustang?" Grace blinked, startled by the question's weight. Granger's gaze narrowed, focused on Storm's flank. "Because, if I'm not mistaken, that marking, it hasn't been seen in nearly 20 years." The crowd leaned forward. Whispers crawled like ivy through the stands, and Storm, unmoving beneath the heat of every eye in the arena, simply flicked his tail, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. The legacy beneath the dust. The stable corridors remained heavy with silence long after the lights of the arena dimmed. The performance had ended, but its echoes lingered in the air like the scent of churned dirt and sweat, alive in the walls, in the stilled breath of those who had witnessed something inexplicable. Grace walked Storm back to stall 47 under a moon that felt strangely brighter than before, its light pooling like liquid silver across the uneven concrete. Lily followed close, her notebook clutched to her chest, though she hadn't written a single word since they left the arena. There was nothing to jot down that could rival what they'd just lived. Inside the stall, Grace removed the makeshift saddle pad and checked Storm's legs. Her hands moved on instinct, but her mind had already begun turning over Granger's words like stones in a dry riverbed. She had no papers, never had. All she knew was what she saw in the horse's eyes the day she found him near the ravine, a memory buried in another lifetime, resurfacing now with teeth. By dawn, a low buzz had spread through the back barns. Whispers moved from stable to stable, like wind through brittle grass. Talk of the wild Mustang with no reins, of the woman who made him dance without touching a rope, of the judge who stood from his seat for the first time in a decade. No one spoke to Grace directly, but eyes followed her with sharpened curiosity. There was reverence, yes, but also suspicion, and more than a trace of jealousy. Storm ate calmly, unfazed by the murmurs beyond the walls. Grace stood outside the stall, arms crossed, watching the horizon over the paddock fencing. The sky was colorless, not quite morning, not yet light. Lily appeared beside her, quiet for a time, until she asked if they were in trouble. Grace didn't answer. Trouble wasn't new. What unsettled her was the word Granger used. Marking. As if this wasn't just about form or talent, but something genetic, something traceable. Later that morning, Grace returned to the arena grounds alone. She carried Storm's old halter with her, not because she needed it, but because it reminded her of the first months they spent learning each other's limits. She bypassed the trainer stations and the sleek warm-blood stalls, walking until the air smelled less of polish and more of hay. She found Thomas Granger near the judge's tent, speaking with two officials in navy blazers. He saw her before she spoke. "You don't have papers," he said, not as a question, but as a certainty. "I found him near Timber Ravine 4 years ago," she replied, voice flat. "Skin and bones, torn leg, no brand, no chip." Granger nodded, rubbing his chin. "There's a reason I asked. Years ago there was a breeding program, private, mostly military affiliated, though unofficial. They worked with Andalusian and Lusitano lines, breeds with strong bone, high intelligence, quick lateral movement. Cavalry horses in essence, bred for finesse under stress. Most of the line vanished after a transport fire, or so the report said. He reached into his coat and produced a small folder. From it, he withdrew a faded photograph, grainy but unmistakable. A gray mare stood poised in the photo, her muscles elegant beneath sun-dappled shade, with a crescent-shaped birthmark above the right flank. She was called Celestia, he said. Disappeared with her unborn foal. If what I saw in that arena was real, and I know it was, your Mustang could be her son. Grace studied the photo in silence. The resemblance was uncanny. Storm's stance, the sloping angle of the withers, the eyes. "But I don't know anything about bloodlines," she muttered. "I'm not part of that world." "Maybe not," Granger said, tucking the photo away. "But the people who ran that world might not want him discovered. There's reputation, money, and pride tied up in blood. If he's what I think he is, someone's going to want to bury it." Back at the stall, Lily met her with a worried glance. "What did he say?" she asked, pacing near the feed bin. "He said we stirred up something bigger than a show ring," Grace replied, "and we need to be ready for pushback." That afternoon, Grace returned to the trailer where she'd kept an old military duffel bag, untouched for years. Inside, among faded field manuals and waterlogged journals, she found a map. Not a competition map, a memory map. Timber Ravine, where she had found Storm, where the soil still bore faint black marks if you knew where to look. Burn marks. She stared at the map long into the evening, eyes tracing the route as if expecting it to answer the unspoken question hanging between her and the Mustang. What had really happened there? Who left him to die? And what did it mean that he lived? Lily sat across the stall, absent-mindedly braiding and unbraiding a piece of baling twine, her mind clearly racing just as much. The silence stretched long, broken only by Storm's steady chewing. Grace didn't answer for a while, then finally whispered, "He remembers something." Horses don't forget pain, even if they can't speak it. Outside, the sun dipped behind the metal roofs of the arena. A shadow passed across the Whitaker name still painted on the trailer, faded, flaking, but still there, still standing. As night came, so did a new unease. A figure loitered too long by stall 47. A saddle strap was found slashed. Storm snorted louder than usual at the midnight hour, and though nothing was said, both Grace and Lily knew something had shifted. What began as an underdog's chance at proving a horse's worth was now the unraveling of a secret someone wanted to keep buried. But Storm didn't flinch. He stood, even in the dark, with ears pointed forward, watching the barn door like a sentinel, and Grace, though weary, found herself doing the same. Because the dust wasn't just underfoot anymore, it was rising, and in it the past was beginning to speak, the fault line beneath the applause. The barn held its breath long after the cheers from the arena died away. Grace felt it in the stillness that settled like a weight on her shoulders, in the unnatural hush between hoofbeats and rustling hay. Storm, too, had grown tense, more alert than usual, his ears flicking toward shadows that hadn't moved before. The air smelled the same, a mix of manure and dust, but something about the texture of the silence had changed, like the calm before a minefield reveals itself. She moved slowly through the stall, brushing Storm's coat with mechanical precision, though her mind churned in chaos. Granger's words echoed louder now, bouncing between memory and fear. That photo, the crescent birthmark, the suggestion of bloodlines better left buried, it all scraped at something deeper than curiosity. It clawed at survival. She had seen men look at wounded soldiers the way Granger had looked at Storm, not with pity, but with awe and calculation. By dusk, Grace had double-checked every latch, retightened the cross ties, and reinforced the back gate with an old lock from her duffel. It wasn't just caution, it was instinct. Something had turned, and if her years in the service taught her anything, it was that the most dangerous threats wore calm like a mask. Storm didn't eat his feed that evening. He sniffed it once, then backed away, his breath hitching in a strange rhythm. Grace crouched beside the bucket, eyes narrowing. The grain looked normal at first glance, but a sharper scent rose the closer she leaned, something acrid, like crushed pepper mixed with oil. Her hand hovered above the grain, and she blinked as the sting of its fumes caught her throat. "Lily," she called quietly, her voice tight, "bring me the flashlight." Lily appeared a second later, eyes wide, flashlight already in hand. Grace tilted the beam over the feed and spotted what she feared. Green strands of hay. Too fresh, too damp, tucked beneath the top layer. A sticky residue clung to a few kernels. Her gut clenched. She pressed her fingers to Storm's muzzle, checking for signs. His lower lip was inflamed, and a faint tremor ran through his front leg. Not enough to collapse him, not yet, but enough to tell her they'd been hit. Not with a blade or a shove. This time it was chemical, deliberate, quiet. "What is it?" Lily's voice cracked. Grace didn't answer. She grabbed a bucket, filled it with water, added salt from their emergency stash, and began rinsing Storm's mouth with slow, steady strokes. The Mustang jerked at first, but then allowed it, breathing through his nostrils like he knew the drill. She flashed back, hot sun, burning sand, a tent blown inward by a concussion blast, the shriek of a medic calling for saline. She'd flushed poison from dying men, but never from a horse. Yet the principle was the same: neutralize, cool, don't panic. "We're okay," she murmured, half to Storm, half to herself. "You're okay." Storm's eyes, glazed with tension, softened a fraction. He leaned into her hand, not out of weakness but trust. Cole Anderson arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by Lily's frantic call. He didn't speak as he approached, just knelt beside Storm and examined the lips, the grain, the hay. Then he said, "Chili oil. Maybe with some industrial solvent. Nothing fatal, but designed to inflame, to make him unwritable." Grace exhaled through her nose, slow and bitter. Someone tampered with his feed. Cole nodded, grim. Someone knew how to make it look harmless, too. Lily stood by the stall door, fists clenched, face flushed with tears she refused to shed. Grace caught her gaze and shook her head slightly. Not now. Not yet. They worked for another hour, clearing feed, rinsing buckets, watching Storm's vitals stabilize. The Mustang's breathing eased by degrees, and the swelling on his lip began to recede, though the fury in Grace's chest burned hotter. Cole gathered a sample into a sealed bag, labeling it with practiced care. "You need to report this," he said. Grace stared at the bag, then past it, to the half-lit stalls where laughter from the Redford camp still drifted like smoke. "They'll call it an accident," she muttered. "Or blame our storage. Not if we get ahead of it," he said. Storm let out a long exhale, nuzzling Grace's shoulder with the weariness of a soldier who'd seen too much. She braced herself against the wall and ran her fingers through his mane. "They're scared," she said. "Not of me, of him, of what he proves." Cole didn't disagree. Instead, he handed her the bag. "Scared men get desperate, watch your back." After he left, Grace and Lily sat in silence. No more tea, no more words, just the creak of wood, the hiss of wind, and the unspoken truth between them. The arena had never been the real battlefield. This was. Lily eventually curled against a pile of hay, half asleep, fingers still wrapped around her sketchbook. Storm stood watch like a sentinel, his eyes dark and unwavering. Grace didn't sleep. She sat upright, one hand on her boot, the other on Storm's neck. They had survived sabotage. Tomorrow they would face the spotlight, and this time they'd be ready. The silence. After the thunder morning had barely broken over the sprawl of Hillstone when a heavy stillness settled over the showgrounds, like the sky itself was bracing for reckoning. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the slats in the barn, illuminating dust that hung in the air, unmoved. The world outside might have been stirring with anticipation, but inside the weathered stall where Grace Whitaker sat beside Storm, everything had narrowed to silence and breath. The Mustang stood tall, his coat dull from fatigue, but his eyes were awake, bright and watching. He had weathered worse than sabotage. So had she. But this was the moment that would make all the suffering mean something or not. Grace had barely slept. Her body had rested, but her thoughts paced through the night, dissecting every angle of what they'd endured. The sabotage attempt had not broken her. It had exposed the stakes. Someone hadn't just tried to eliminate the competition. They had tried to erase a truth. And truths like Storm's once seen could not be unseen. That made them dangerous. That made them worth protecting. Lily approached just after dawn, clutching a clipboard and a tremble in her voice. "We're still on," she said. "Midday slot." Grace didn't answer right away. She was adjusting Storm's halterless bridle, fingers deliberate, breath steady. This wasn't about slots or applause. It wasn't even about redemption anymore. It was about drawing a line in the dirt and standing on it. As the arena's bustle crescendoed into showtime, the contrast between them and the other competitors became clearer than ever. While neighboring stalls bustled with gleaming equipment, custom tack, and whispered betting odds, Grace's corner remained calm, utilitarian, grounded. She wore the same faded shirt from the day before, same worn boots. Her saddle, polished but plain, rested beside her on a bale of hay. Storm had no braids in his mane, no decorative wraps on his legs. There was no illusion here, only truth. When they entered the arena, the temperature seemed to shift. Conversations paused. Even the announcer fumbled, stumbling over Grace's name, uncertain whether to introduce her with reverence or pity. She gave him neither. With a subtle squeeze of her thigh and a tilt of her hip, she guided Storm forward. No reins, no pressure. Just a dance between breath and weight, intuition and memory. They began slowly, letting the stillness settle, letting the audience adjust their expectations. Storm's steps were unhurried but deliberate, movements whispering control rather than shouting it. A half-pass drifted into a pirouette so fluid it seemed unmoored from gravity. Then, without warning, Storm lifted into a levade. Front legs raised, hind legs crouched, holding the suspended tension of a bow without breaking. A breath, a hush, then applause thundered around them. But as the cheers faded, a sharper sound followed. Thomas Granger's voice, clipped and unwavering. "Miss Whitaker," he said from the judge's box, "do you have registration documents for this horse?" She dismounted without pause. "No," she answered, her tone resolute. "I found him abandoned near Timber Ravine. No papers, no claims." Granger stepped into the ring, the crowd parting to let him through. His gaze, steady and clinical, swept over Storm like a scanner. Then, crouching beside the Mustang's flank, he brushed aside a patch of hair. There, faint but undeniable, a crescent-shaped birthmark shimmered beneath the sunlight. A murmur passed through the crowd. One part recognition, one part disbelief. Granger straightened. "This horse matches the description of a missing foal from the Celestia line. A specialized Andalusian cross bred for intelligence, poise, and battlefield resilience. She vanished, along with her unborn foal, nearly a decade ago. The owner claimed an accident." Jeremiah Cole appeared from the crowd then, tired, gaunt, but unmistakable. "Celestia was mine," he said hoarsely. "Chuck Redford bought her for breeding. Said she died in a trailer accident. But I always knew. I never saw the body, never saw the colt." Gasps rippled through the stands. All eyes turned as Chuck Redford pushed forward, his mouth already curling into a sneer. But before he could speak, Cole Anderson stepped into the clearing. "I worked his stables last season," he said. "I heard him give orders to abandon a pregnant mare in the ravine. He wanted to wipe the slate clean, claim the estate. Storm survived. That wasn't the plan. The evidence, the birthmark, the testimonies, the bag of tainted feed, formed a noose of facts." Chuck's son, Travis, stood paralyzed, his earlier arrogance draining away, and when Granger announced that Redford Estate was under suspension, the crowd erupted. Not with chaos, but with clarity. Justice wasn't just a matter of law. It was truth made visible. Grace stood beside Storm, her hand resting on his neck, her body steady as stone. When Jeremiah turned to her, he was holding a faded folder. Inside, the original breeding documents, veterinary charts, and letters dated years before. "They always said the colt would have been exceptional," he murmured. "Turns out he just needed the right fight to prove it." She nodded, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. "We don't need trophies. We needed this." Later, long after the dust had settled and the banners had been taken down, a new sign was hung at the entrance of Grace's rebuilt ranch. Whitaker Cole Horsemanship Sanctuary. Below it, a carved line read, "Where lost things come home." Storm grazed quietly in the field behind it, his scars faint, his strength unshaken. He had never needed a name to prove who he was. The world had simply needed time to catch up. And Grace, sitting beneath the shade of the porch, a mug in hand and Lily sketching nearby, felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been there in years. Peace earned, not given.